Thank you very much. I was just trying to organize my screen a little bit more. Yeah, as Carl said, last year I tried to talk about 3 aircraft, but managed only the 2. So tonight the tail of the tails is carrying on. And again, a tail will be part of the tail. So in the last time we saw where Wichita is in the USA, right in the middle of the middle. And we talked about the city, that it was known for a few other things as well. Amongst them, the Coleman Company, who made the famous pocket stoves, over 1 million of them, that all the soldiers used. The town was also very famous for the ponchos that turned into tents that they made. But the main thing was that that town was the air capital of the world. 5 years after the Wright brothers had their first flight, the first airplane built for commercial purposes was built in Wichita. And in the years to come, up to the 1940s, all the famous names were there: Lloyd Stearman and Walter and Olive Beech and Cessna and Lear, Mooney, the whole lot of them. So, okay. Now, in the previous time, we talked about this, the 8010, the Wichita, which was a training aircraft. Over half of the U.S. Army Air Force pilots received their transitional training from single to multi-engines in this aircraft. It was also the aircraft that was used to train all the ladies, all the ferry pilots, all the WASPs. And then you have this Cessna Bobcat, which was on the other side, the training aircraft, all the Air Corps pilots, all the bomber pilots, they did their advanced training in it. And then tonight we're having the third one, which is also a trainer, which was used as 2 types of trainers. The one was to train the navigators, and then this one here in the front, the version, the 8011, what was known as a Ganston, and that was to train bombardiers. And then it had the third row. It was also a passenger, small passenger, 6-7 passenger and freight plane. So now just to recap on the Beech history. In 1924, Beech was able to get Clyde Cessna, who had an aircraft accident, and decided to retire to get him back. And with Lloyd Stearman, they started a company, Travel Air. And then with the looming depression, Travel Air became a division of Curtis Wright. And you will see that I will have to jump a little bit forward and backwards in history. So we will get back to this whole Styger wing story, but Curtis Wright did not want to produce the designer Ted Wells's Styger wing. And so therefore, Beech and Ted Wells, they went and Cessna gave them a small corner of their factory to start producing in. And they produced this Styger wing plane then that the others didn't want to produce, and that was a huge success, and that created the money. They were starting to sell it in large quantities, and this enabled them to then move forward. And we decided on a twin-engine monoplane. And again, that also made the split again with Cessna, because Cessna at the end wanted to go with different aeroplanes, so they all split up again. But okay, so what happened is, what we also saw last year was in 1934, the government banned single-engine aircraft from carrying passengers or night flying. And at that time, Lloyd Stearman was already with Lockheed, and they designed the Electra, and so they were very well positioned. And Beech decided that that is the market that they should enter as well. There was another impetus for this development, and that was that the Department of Transport put out a competition by the Air Commerce Department in 35, and the whole idea was to get and find a plane that all the small operators can use, because at that time everybody that kind of needed an airplane had to build it themselves. So again, Lockheed with Lloyd Stearman was way ahead. They just scaled down the Electra 10, and so they created a plane that met all the requirements of this competition. So these two things convince Beech to do and to create a plane like that. And then Ted Wells set out to design that. So, okay, so the Beech 18 story, like the 17, the Styger wing, is the story about Ted Wells. And I thought that I would like to tell you a little bit about this very interesting gentleman. Now, he was born in 1907 in Corning, Iowa, and he was the first aeronautical engineering graduate at Princeton University. And he himself explained in different interviews that he rocked up there at Princeton, and where they just started an engineering department, and he said he wanted to study engineering, but he wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. And so they said to him, okay, well, you give us the requirements, and then you satisfy them, and that's how he went along. So when he was in his sophomore year, Wells and a classmate, they bought old Jenny from World War I, looking like that, without their parents and anybody else knowing. And so they had this scheme where they offered the plane for lessons and rides, charging $25 an hour, which I think was really a huge sum of money for that time. So paying an instructor $10 and then keeping $15 to pay the airplane. Oh, but in the end, they got in trouble at the university because Wells one day could not drive with a car, and he flew to the university with a plane, so that was a bit of a commotion. Now, in his junior year, he was hired as a part-time demonstration pilot. So by that time, he was really an excellent pilot already. And then when he graduated in 29, he was hired by the company as a full-time design engineer, because that was the time that Cessna and Lloyd Stearman left. And in 28, so that was in his junior year, he already bought one of Travel Air's aircraft, one that was still designed and built by Lloyd Stearman. You can see it looks a bit like the other Stearman's Boeing. And he entered races with that, and he won a race. So he was really a good pilot. And now he was started working as the designer. Now, what is really most impressive to me is this guy, in his first year after university, in his spare time, 1930, he designed and built this incredible racer. So he was really just brilliant and an excellent guy that could actually do the work also, and he built this very successful racing plane. But during the flight test, he was flying 200 miles an hour at 500 feet, and both ailerons tore off the wings. So he managed to bail out and deploy that old parachute. That must be a miracle in itself. And so he ended with a broken ankle when he landed in the mud. And that was the end of his races, but we will get back to that. So they were really a talented guy. So, as I say, we're jumping a bit forward and backward in time. So in 31, he first designed the Model 17, the Styger plane, what we've seen. And then after that, he started to do the 18, and they also did quite a lot of very famous aircraft. So now we're jumping a little bit ahead of time. That was the 8010 we talked about, and he saw some Polish engineers using a V-tail. So at the very end of the war, he tried V-tails on that 8010, and it worked successfully. And although it looks so modern, but the first Bonanza was produced in 1947. One cannot really believe it. With the V-tail. Then later on it had the upright tail as well as this. Another famous plane that he designed that's still used in parts of the world is the Mentor Trainer, which first had radial engines and these days turbine engines. Later the Twin Bonanza, and after the war he also designed, and they built one prototype of this so-called twin quad, but that was not ordered by the Air Force, so that was the only one they did. So he was quite a very famous, and as I say, these magnificent planes, to think they're coming out of 1947 and 1953, that's still very incredible. Okay, so, but then we're into the second life. After his accident with his plane, he got interested into sailing. So he joined the sailing club, and with his knowledge of foils, of wings and propellers and stuff, he immediately excelled in understanding how to sail and how to use the sails. So he redesigned these boats, and he became an expert builder. And in the end, he won not only the national championships, but also the world championships with these particular boats, which are still used in the Olympic Games today. And he then authored this book, Scientific Sailboat Racing, which is still a standard in the sport today. But then he had a third life as well. When Walter Beech died in 1950, Olive Ann became the president, although most say she was always the president. And she didn't like these sailing activities, and she thought he was too much away from the work. And he was attending regatta again in 1953. She sent an aircraft to bring him back. And they had the meeting, and she said to him, wow, she wanted to give him all the free time he needed, and so she had him resigned, although he was a director, and he did, and he took the plane back, and he started competing in the regatta again. And then he made a total turn around, and he became a banker. He used his money, and he bought the Union National Bank of Wichita, which was a regional bank. He was never a hands-on banker, but he was a strategic decision maker, an investor, and he was known countrywide in the USA as a visionary banker. And he made this bank very quickly to be one of the most successful banks in the USA. So he died in 1991 at the age of 84, having had 3 full, very impressive lives. He was really a brilliant man. Okay, so now we're back at the Beech 18. And for years and years, there's this debate of whether he copied that Electra, which was then the market leader. And the quick answer is no. Now, this guy, Edward Phillips, he in the last few years, I think he must maybe be an employee of Beechcraft, but he wrote in the King Air magazine from about 2015 some most remarkable articles on the history of Beech and Beechcraft aircraft. And so for this part, I am really quoting him bit by bit, but I did check all the facts in the other sources. So the reason for the twin vertical stabilizers, so now you can see we're into the tail of the tails, was caused by the science of stress analysis, which was not that clearly understood and the mathematics not that clear in the mid-1930s. So when he designed that Styger wing, the Bureau of Commerce criticized his mathematics and his calculations, and they even wrote a letter to his boss, Walter Beech, and say, you've got a little bit of a amateur new designer there, which should study his maths a little bit more. And therefore, he did then 10 years experience of welded steel, but he was a bit then not so happy to do all metal frame monocoque. So in the end, he decided to go back to welded steel tubing clad in aluminium, because that was what he was comfortable with and knew he could do and design well. So still then the mathematics of the tail section. So he decided, well, he won't be able to do the calculations, and therefore they decided on two vertical stabilizers and do the calculations for each as a single structure. But there was another very important aspect here, and that is the question of a very stable planes under one engine operation. Remember, this plane, excuse me, the Beech 18 was designed to meet this requirement as a plane for all the small operators. And in the end of the 1930s, engines were not that reliable, and it was very important for the government that the plane that all the operators should use, especially when carrying passengers, should be a very stable plane under one engine conditions. Later on, with this plane being so stable, that was one of the main reasons why the US military used that in all the training applications. So the choice of engine was very easy. They tried the Jacobs engines, which we saw that was used in the 8010, but that had only 270 horsepower. So again, not enough for single engine use. So I had the choice between the 7-cylinder Wright engine and the Pratt & Whitney engine. So both of them 350 horses. He decided on the R7060 because he knew that well from the Styger wings. That's the engine that looked like that. And the only thing is, in this picture, the exhaust is sitting here in front. But of course, in these planes, they swapped it to sit at the back. They just changed the manifolds the other side around. This is a Pratt & Whitney engine, but it shows you where the exhaust sits. Okay, and then to reduce the drag, this tight cowling with what they call small blisters here to fit over these rocker covers. Now, when I had to look at these photos, I wondered about these very long exhaust pipes because they look odd. It's something that you do not see on other planes. Now, fortunately, we have the engine guru amongst us. So I asked John Smith now, would this be maybe a muffler, or why is there this very long exhaust? And he immediately wrote me an answer and said, no, take a look at the Canadian T6s. And as you can see, he was immediately spot on, because the Canadian harvest got these long exhausts, and that explained the whole story. You can see there's a little shining pipe there and a little shining pipe there. If you look at it from this way, there's a hole in the exhaust. And that pipe goes through there, through the exhaust manifold. So what happens is the fresh air is forced into that tube. The air is heated in the exhaust, and then it goes into the cabin and it heats the plane inside. And that was a trick they did in Canada, because it's so cold up there, to heat the cabin of the and that was the same method that they used to heat the cabin of that Beech 18, by using these kind of exhaust heaters that heats fresh air. So it's fresh air that goes into the cabin, heated by that. So that is something I never knew. Okay. So then, still with the requirements of the competition, remember it's pre-war. It was the selection and how the wing should look was very important, because it was imperative that the wing should produce generous lift with minimum drag for planes to land and take off from small rural airfields. Fly very stable at low airspeeds, and safe stall characteristics. Okay, and now I just want to have a little interlude and take a sub way here. And the pilots amongst you would know about this, but just for interest's sake, in 1935, there was this document published, which I think is, in my sense, even a greater achievement than the Wright brothers flying. This made a much more important contribution to flying right up to today. And this was the work at NACA at the time, these days NASA. Under the chief guy there was Eastman Jacobs. And this paper was published by Jacobs and Ward and Pinkerton. And it was a standardization with the most incredible invention to standardize any airfoil, the mathematics in it. Now, as I'm interested in people again, I was amazed that Jacobs received this, which is kind of a Nobel Prize of Engineering Awards, but the rest of the team, Ward and Pinkerton, the co-authors, but also very famous, Abbott and Wyke, and also the France, which I do not know, but Abbott and Wyke are also very famous engineers all the way in NASA. They didn't receive any recognition in terms of prize for this very, very, very famous document. So what they did is they had 68 different airfoil profiles, and they analyzed them, and in the end they find that there's a standard set of mathematics. There's a standard mathematical relationship in any airfoil, and you can do the calculations for the lift and the drag and everything for any profile using these formula. And that is mind-boggling, and without that, any form of airfoils from surfboards right up to wind turbine blades, anything would never have been so easy to design without this magnificent invention of theirs. So this was just in time for Ted to use. So he built a wooden model, took it to Wichita State University, which had one of the very first wind tunnels. And there he did his studies by using these profiles. And he made something that was not thought possible. He was the very first person to combine two of these profile designs mathematical models, and he combined that profile 2312 looking like that, and profile 2318. So 2318 was used in the first part of the wing, and then from the engines outward 2312 was all the way to the wingtips. Now, just to show you, I just took one article. This is a 2023 article, but I can even show you 2025 articles where every design, winglets, as I say, drones, model airplanes, wind turbines, everybody still use those profiles, that set of fixed mathematical relationships. So in this article, for instance, again, they state that 2312 airfoil is one of the most widely used airfoils in aviation because of high lift, low drag, mild pitching, and maintaining laminar flow on the lower surface. So it's a symmetric design, identical upper and lower surfaces. And so it gives you a well-balanced air wing. And again, a lift to be maintained at zero angle of attack. And that's the stuff that they needed for his airplane. And yeah, again, here in that article, they list some of the advantages of that 23 profile: low drag, stable handling, aerobatic performance, cost-effective, and precise aerodynamic assessment. So just again showing the genius of Ted Wells, that amongst those 68 profiles, very brand new, he chose the correct two to make the design. What he further did was also a first for that time, is he then also decided that the wing chord should be feather changed by a 3.5-degree twist. And so to the tip, and that was again approach and landing speeds. Remember why he's designing this airplane? For small rural airfields. It's called the washout, and that means that the wing root had an angle of incidence that gradually decreased towards the wing tip, and I will show you now how that looks. So it gives you a smooth airflow over the ailerons for roll control when the wing stalled. So really a most impressive, clever design. Now I found this 3D model, and which shows how the wings work and how they change the angle and become flat towards the ends, more curved near the plane. So you have the one profile up to the engine, and then from the engines outwards you have the other profile. It was really, really brilliant, absolute genius to do that, and that's why this plane is still flying today and why it was produced right into the 1980s, because it is the most fantastic plane that Ted Wells designed. Yeah. Okay. But all cannot be so very good. And this plane had one problem. This is the main wing spar. There, the engines and the wheels will fit onto, and that fits to the fuselage. So it's with this one single tube monospar, and that was the Achilles heel of this plane, because that was covered up, so it rusted, and they only discovered that it had a problem when they started cracking and breaking, and a few planes made accidents. So Then they changed it, and yeah, from in World War, they had a standard procedure to check on all of them. But in later years, in the 60s and so on, when all small operators used these post-war planes in South America, where they used it in the drug smuggling, they didn't look after these parts, and they still had quite a few accidents because of the rust, hidden rust in that. Okay, so again, first person to do it, he had electrically operated flaps, and all the elevators and the rudders and stuff, aluminium alloy, and then covered with cotton fabric. That I still don't know why they did that, except for ease of repair. But for the rest, I really don't know why that's not also covered in with the aluminium. Like we saw with the other two planes, the Cessna and the 8010, they had these landing gear. And maybe you can remember from previous year, during wartime, they standardized on these. This is the same as that you find on the T6 Harvard, except these were made stronger for the because this plane is heavier, but it's the same as on the Cessna and as on the 8010 and also on the Harvard and many other planes. The tail wheel should retract. I don't know why this one does not retract. And then the wheels sticking out there, just like with the other two aircraft that was specifically designed that way for in wartime and for training aircraft, because when the student pilot's doing wheels up landing, forgetting to let the wheels down, then the damage to the aircraft is minimal because there will be a little bit of wheels still to land on. And last year I showed you photographs of the minimal damage when student pilots during World War II did these wheels up landings. The first controls were really rudimentary, and I mean to get your feet to touch there, or I think must have been a problem. So by the time of World War II, it looked a lot better, and better pedals and controls and everything in there. So now what is also very impressive is they took 13 months. I think it was 7 persons, 7 employees working for Beech, who built this airplane from scratch. So they had to make tools and dies, everything. They had to manufacture each and every part by hand and machine. And so it took them 13 months to build this airplane, and they rolled it out of the factory. Now, the test crew were Homer Rankin, James Payton, and Robert Johnson. Now, again, wanting to know about the people, this is also a story which took me quite a lot of time, because the test pilot for Beech was this gentleman, Homer Ding Rankin. And I could find no information on him whatsoever. All that in the end that I could find was a newspaper obituary of his wife. And in that it was referred to him and said that she was the widow of the late Colonel Homer Rankin. So all that I can deduct from that is that he sometimes joined the military, maybe died in World War II, but I could find no information on him whatsoever. Fortunately, the other 2 gentlemen who were the first test pilots of this very famous pioneering airplane, both of them, they became very famous, because Payton at the time was already working for the Bureau of Aeronautics, and he also tested the official test of the Styger wing. But then interestingly, the right engine company, they sent one of their, what we would call today, reps, Robert Johnson, to be the other representative. Now, this Jason Painton, he became very famous after the war, 1950s, 60s. He was, for all of us who watch aircraft, the aircraft accidents, we know the Civil Aeronautics Board. He became the chief of investigation. And in the 1950s and 60s, he was many times in the news because of air crashes that he investigated. He was also the primary witness in a lot of court cases where passengers and people sue the aircraft companies and so on. So he was, in the end, a very famous guy. The salesman, he had a long career working for United Airlines. In the end, he retired as vice president of the company and the director, and he wrote this famous book on Airway One about the history of United Airlines. He himself joined the military during the war. He was a Naval Air Combat Intelligence officer, but then after the war returned to United Airways, and he also wrote two other books about aircraft. So those were the three famous test pilots of this plane. Now, incredible, you'd have 7 people build the plane for 13 months, and they take it off and they fly for 15 minutes without one problem. That is just incredible. The only change they made on that first plane that they built is the Pratt & Whitney 985 was junior engine then became available, and that had a whole 100 more horsepower. So again, the importance, and then the war was looming, so the importance of single engine performance, and also increasing the ceiling, being able to fly higher, became more important. So they switched the engines to these 450 horsepower Wasp Juniors, and that was in all the planes for the rest of the production life of this plane, which spanned nearly 30 years. So just a bit of size info here, and I will now compare it to a Baron, which will give you a little bit more detail. But the important thing here was the service ceiling of 26 feet, 26,000 feet, and that was possible by that stronger engines. And again, that also influenced the military to use these planes as the trainers, because they wanted to train the bomber crews to fly at high altitudes, to use oxygen. And this was the only training plane available that could fly that height and which they can use in that training row. So just a little comparison with the Baron that we know, and you can see it's about a third more. 11 meters versus 15 and 8 and 10 and so on. Speed about the same, 200 miles an hour, but in a higher service ceiling. Okay, now just to enjoy the beauty of this plane, I made a little video. As you can hear, it's very much like 2 hours coming past. Let's just get this slide now too. All right, there we go. So this was then wartime. Here's the couple, Beech, Walter and Olive Ann, in their factory there in Wichita. where they were building then all these aircraft for the war, and the number of employees in about 5 years' time increased from 7 to several thousand to build all these planes for the military. Now, this plane had over its life identity crisis. Is the plane with the most names, I think, possible. It was the 87 and 11 in the seas, and the Navy had another names, and after the war it still had another set of names. Okay, now, Carl, this is morely near. I'm not sure if I'm really halfway, but I think this is more or less an hour's time. So maybe before we get into the